Forget those shimmering Christmas paintings with warm candlelight. Forget the pristine, dustless white robes you see in Hollywood movies. The reality of the world Jesus lived in was 1,000 times more brutal than you can imagine. Did you know that in first-century Judea, stepping out of your house after sunset was practically a suicidal act? With no police and no streetlights, the locked city gates left you stranded outside with the darkness and wild beasts. The lives of the disciples weren't casual strolls. They were a breathless survival thriller played out amidst Roman oppression, the filth of disease and the blades of bandits. Today, we are tearing back the veil of history, using archaeology to recreate the true smells, sounds, and fears of Jerusalem in the year 30. Are you brave enough to step into this alleyway with me? Ladies and gentlemen, if we had a time machine and flew a drone over Nazareth or Capernaum in 30 AD, the first shock to hit you would be the color, or rather the total lack thereof. There were no red-tiled roofs or whitewashed walls. Everything was a monotonous, dusty brown of raw limestone and sun-dried mud bricks. The houses blended so seamlessly into the arid hills that from a distance, it was hard to tell where nature ended and human habitation began. But let's lower our altitude to the ground. Welcome to what they called streets in the time of Jesus. In reality, these weren't roads. They were mere gaps, rugged dirt paths, rarely wider than 2 meters, with no sidewalks for pedestrians. Picture this. You are walking through the market. Beside you, a heavily laden donkey pants with exhaustion. Ahead, a group of people is shouting in an argument, and right beneath your feet, raw sewage trickles down the middle of the path. It was, in the most literal sense, a desperate struggle for space. Why did they build this way? Was it a lack of planning? No, it was the architecture of defense. Look at the houses lining the street. They resemble small fortresses, thick walls, heavy wooden doors, and notably no windows facing the street. Why? Because the street was considered a place of danger, a realm of bandits, Roman soldiers, and prying eyes. The people of that era built their homes with their backs turned to the outside world. Entire lives unfolded in the inner courtyard, the only place they truly felt safe. However, this security created a fascinating paradox of sound. Houses were built with shared walls to save materials and increase structural integrity. This meant that privacy was virtually non-existent. In Nazareth, silence was a luxury item that no one could afford. You could hear neighbors arguing over a meal, a baby crying next door, and the loud rumble of grain mills starting from the crack of dawn. In the world of Jesus, you were never truly alone. You lived under the auditory surveillance of the entire community. Everyone knew what you ate, what you did, and when you slept. And on those cramped streets, there was an unwritten law that everyone had to memorize, the law of the strong. If you caught the glint of a Roman helmet or saw a tax collector approaching on horseback, your survival reflex kicked in instantly. Press yourself against the filthy mud walls, bow your head, and hold your breath. In that narrow space, whoever held the sword held the right of way. The rest of the populace quite literally had to shrink themselves to survive. Now let's try knocking on a door and stepping into a typical Galilean home. The first thing to assault your senses won't be a sight, but the temperature and the smell. Your eyes will need a few seconds to adjust to the darkness, but your nose will immediately detect a pungent mixture. The smell of cooking smoke clinging to the walls, the scent of straw, and the stench of fresh livestock manure. Wait, livestock? Inside the house? Exactly. You might have expected a living room with a sofa, but instead you are looking at a biological heating system. Nights in the Judean desert are bone-chillingly cold, and with no electricity or gas heaters, how did a poor family stay warm? The solution was to bring the heaters inside: goats, sheep, and donkeys. The architecture of the home was usually divided into 2 levels. The lower level, a dirt floor right by the entrance, was where the livestock slept. The upper level, a stone platform raised about half a meter, was where the family lived, ate, and slept. The body heat rising from these 50 to 60 kilogram animals would warm the human living area. Sleeping next to the heavy breathing of a cow wasn't a sign of extreme poverty, It was survival wisdom. And here is the detail that will completely change how you view Christmas. At the edge of that stone platform, the boundary between the human and animal quarters, people would often carve hollows into the rock or place wooden boxes to hold straw for the animals. That is called a manger. When the Bible says Mary placed the infant in a manger because there was no room in the inn, it doesn't necessarily mean they were kicked out into a cold, desolate stable in the middle of nowhere. It is very likely they were on the ground floor of a relative's house. But because the guest room on the upper floor was already packed with visitors, the Holy Family had to stay on the lower level, sleeping among the livestock to keep warm. It is an image of humility, but also one that is very practical and cozy in the ancient Jewish way. That was winter. But what about summer? When the heat turned the stone house into a 40 degrees Celsius kiln, life moved upward. The flat roof made of branches plastered with clay became the primary bedroom. It was the only place where you could catch a bit of the night breeze and escape the pungent smell of ammonia from below. Imagine Jesus and his disciples lying on the roof, gazing up at a sky full of stars and listening to the desert wind. These were rare moments of peace in an otherwise harsh existence. Leaving the house behind, let us talk about the most vital thing of all: water. Today you simply open the fridge for a bottle or turn on a tap, but in the first century a cup of cool water was the result of backbreaking labor and political risk. The lifeline of the entire family rested on the shoulders of the women. They had to trek to the village well, usually located on the outskirts of town, and carry back heavy ceramic jars filled with water. When full, these jars weighed over 20 kilograms. Imagine carrying a microwave oven on your shoulder for several kilometers under the scorching sun, every single day. Yet the physical burden was nothing compared to the social pressure. The well wasn't just a place to get water, it was the Facebook and TikTok of the ancient world. It was where news spread, where mothers scouted for daughters-in-law, and where a person's reputation was built or destroyed. Your absence or presence at the well during certain hours said everything about your social standing. The unwritten rule was that respectable women with stable families would go in groups during the cool of the early morning or late afternoon. Was there a particular part of this historical context you wanted to emphasize for a specific project or story? So, if you saw a woman fetching water at the 6th hour, meaning 12 noon, when the sun is at its peak and the heat is like liquid fire, it wasn't a matter of preference, it was an act of evasion. She accepted the scorching heat on her skin rather than endure the judgmental glares and whispers of her neighbors. This context makes the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well in John chapter 4 truly earth-shattering. Jesus wasn't just asking for water, he was stepping into a forbidden zone of social shame to rescue a soul in isolation. Furthermore, water held another layer of meaning: purification. The Pharisees weren't obsessed with bacteria. They didn't know what bacteria were yet. They were obsessed with spiritual impurity. Washing hands before a meal or bathing in a mikveh, ritual bath, wasn't about scrubbing off dirt. It was about washing away contact with a sinful world. Water was the boundary between the sacred and the profane. We often imagine Jesus living in total isolation in a rustic village, but archaeological reality tells a far more fascinating story. Nazareth was indeed a tiny conservative village, but just 6 kilometers away, less than an hour's walk, was a completely different world, like stepping from Earth onto Mars. That was the city of Sepphoris, the jewel of Galilee. If Nazareth was the brown of the earth, Sepphoris was the blinding white of marble. If Nazareth was silent, Sepphoris was a bustling hub of 30,000 residents, complete with an open-air theater and villas adorned with exquisite floor mosaics. Keep in mind that Jesus and St. Joseph were tectons, craftsmen/builders. This proximity to a Romanized city really reframes the quiet carpenter narrative, doesn't it? Are you exploring this specifically for a historical study or perhaps a script? It is highly likely that they walked to Sepphoris to labor on the massive reconstruction projects of the city. The cultural shock would have been immense. In Nazareth, depicting the human form was taboo. In Sepphoris, statues of Greek and Roman gods lined the streets. In Nazareth, modesty was golden. In Sepphoris, Roman men trained naked in gymnasiums. Galilee was not just a place for shepherding, it was a cultural battlefield. Jesus grew up right at the intersection of strict Jewish tradition and the decadent luxury of Roman civilization. It was this very friction that set the stage for his powerful teachings about the kingdom of heaven in opposition to the kingdoms of this world. Leaving the city, however, meant entering the death zone. Today, traveling 30 kilometers is a minor task, but in those days, stepping outside the city gates was an act of bravery, even recklessness. The roads didn't belong to you, they belonged to bandits. The most famous and terrifying route was the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. People called it the Way of Blood. The terrain was steeply sloped, flanked by limestone cliffs riddled with natural caves. It was a paradise for ambushers. They could spot you from miles away, launch a surprise attack, and vanish into the caves before anyone could cry for help. This is why the concept of a lone traveler was madness. You had to travel in caravans. The whole village went together. The entire extended family went together. This explains how Jesus was lost at age 12. Saint Joseph and the Virgin Mary were not irresponsible parents. In a chaotic, noisy caravan stretching for over a kilometer, assuming your child was up ahead with aunts or uncles was perfectly normal. But bandits weren't the only threat. There was also a legal bandit, the Roman soldier. On the road, you could be stopped by a squad at any moment. There was a deeply resentful law known as the impression law or the mile law. Any Roman soldier had the right to drop his heavy pack at a Jewish man's feet and command, "Carry this for me." By law, you were forced to carry it for 1 Roman mile, roughly 1.5 kilometers. Imagine the humiliation. You are rushing home to your wife and children, and suddenly you are forced into hard labor for the enemy occupying your land. You had to bow your head, grit your teeth, and endure their mockery. In that context, Jesus' teaching struck like a bolt of lightning. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. This wasn't about weakness, it was about reclaiming agency. I am not walking because I fear you. I am walking because I am more generous than you. I am freer than you. It was a revolution of human dignity. And then, after that grueling journey, you finally reach Jerusalem, the holy city. You expect peaceful serenity, but reality slaps you in the face. During Passover, the Temple of Jerusalem didn't look like a quiet church. It resembled an industrial slaughterhouse. Tens of thousands of lambs were sacrificed in a single day. The signature scent of Jerusalem wasn't incense. It was the pungent metallic stench of fresh blood mingled with the acrid smell of burning fat. The stone floors of the temple were slick with blood. The priests worked barefoot, their robes drenched in red, moving in a frantic high-pressure rhythm. There was even a subterranean hydraulic system designed to funnel that river of blood out of the temple and down into the Kidron Valley, dyeing the stream below crimson. And the sound. It wasn't melodic hymns. It was the harrowing cries of livestock and the noisy haggling of money changers and pigeon sellers in the court of the Gentiles. Exchange your money! Exchange your money! Roman coins were considered unclean and had to be swapped for temple currency at extortionate rates. The house of prayer had indeed become a den of thieves. Jesus' fury when he overturned the tables wasn't a loss of control. It was a protest against an exploitative system masquerading as religion. But where did the waste of this massive city go? Animal carcasses, refuse, and even the bodies of executed criminals were tossed into a valley south of the city, the Hinnom Valley. Here, fires burned day and night to incinerate the filth. Black smoke billowed constantly, the stench was overpowering, and maggots swarmed. When Jesus spoke of hell, he wasn't using an abstract concept. He was pointing his finger toward that smoldering landfill that everyone could see and smell. It was the most vivid visual image of destruction, a place where life is discarded and deemed utterly worthless. Finally, as the sun dipped behind the Judean hills, a primal fear took hold. For us, night is merely a time to flip a switch. For them, night was death. Oil for lamps was expensive, the darkness was absolute, and the city gates were bolted shut. If you were 5 minutes late, our condolences, you would be sleeping in the open fields with wolves and bandits. There were no exceptions. But even inside the house, you weren't truly safe. Thieves of that era didn't pick locks. Locks were rare and costly. In Greek, a thief was often referred to as a wall digger. They would silently tunnel through the dried mud walls at the back of the house. The true horror of the night was lying awake, listening to a rustling sound and the pitter-patter of falling dirt, knowing someone was boring a hole into your home. This brings a new visceral meaning to Jesus' teaching: be the light of the world. Light wasn't just a philosophy, it was life itself, it was security, it was the only thing that could drive away the terrors lurking in the shadows. Yet this entire world, dusty, noisy, harsh, yet pulsing with life, had an expiration date. In the year 70 AD, the apocalypse came for Jerusalem. It arrived not with the sound of angelic trumpets, but with the roar of the Roman legions. General Titus besieged the city, and the famine became so horrific that people resorted to cannibalism. The city walls crumbled, and the temple, that eternal pride, burned so fiercely that the gold melted and seeped into the crevices between the stones. Roman soldiers pried up every single stone to recover that gold, exactly fulfilling Jesus' chilling prophecy: not one stone here will be left on another. If you dig beneath the ground of Jerusalem today, you will find a layer of pitch-black ash, the destruction layer. It is Rome's signature, the final period at the end of an era. But, ladies and gentlemen, while the stones collapsed, the roads were buried, and the coins rusted away, one thing survived and emerged from those ashes: the Word. The ideas and teachings born on those dusty roads, by those sun-scorched wells, and upon those simple rooftops were not buried. They spread far beyond the Roman Empire and continue to change your life and mine today. When we look back at the brutal world of Jesus, we don't just see dust and blood, we see resilience. We see a light that shines brightest when it pierces the deepest darkness. Does the Bible feel more alive to you after this journey? Which detail shocked you the most? Was it the reality of the manger, the literal landfill of hell, or the law of the second mile? This historical deep dive really strips away the Sunday school polish and replaces it with something much more grit and bone. Are you putting these segments together for a documentary script or a historical presentation?